Just want to thank everybody for coming out to Pizza and Politics. Our guest tonight is James Humphreys. James Humphreys is the Vice President of the Utah chapter of the Log Cabin Republicans, and we'd like to thank him for coming out today. Just before we get started, at the end of this presentation, the College Republicans will be meeting in the library. So if there is anybody that's interested in joining or has questions for the College Republicans, you're invited to stay after. So just give a little information on James. James was born in San Jose, California. His father was in the military, which meant that he moved around a lot. He did serve an LDS mission to San Antonio, Texas as a sign language elder. Upon his return to America, or to Utah, James majored in music and attended Weber State University. While at Weber State, he was elected the Arts and Humanities Student Senator and worked on a major funding project for the Browning Center for the Performing Arts. James has spent much time involved in politics. Although he spent 10 years in information systems and technology fields as a systems analyst and trainer. James did begin his own financial services company, but in 2010 he closed the mortgage side of the business and has continued consulting, although on the side. Politically, James has interned on the Hill as well as serving in the Leavitt administration as an analyst working on the I-15 rebuild in Salt Lake and the Olympic preparations. James was elected VP of the Log Cabin Republicans in 2009 and has been in that position ever since. He also sits on a number of national boards as well as on many campaigns. And we'd like to now welcome James and to give him a nice round of applause.
Can everyone hear me? I prefer not to use the mic unless I have to. Okay. So as he said, I'm James. I'm with Utah Log Cabin Republicans. I sit on a number of other national boards, and currently I'm running a governor's campaign, 2 congressional campaigns, 3 state legislative campaigns, and working on the Hill every day, and skip CPAC so we can be here tonight while we send candidates back to DC for some other things. So I'm kind of a junkie, a little addicted. You should avoid that at all costs. There's just no money in politics. I like to ask a few questions about what kind of audience we have up front. First, how many of you consider yourselves Republicans? Raise your hands, okay? How many of you consider yourselves Democrats? How many of you think the whole political process sucks? Okay, that includes most Republicans, that's good. How many of you are actually registered with the party? Okay. So not near enough of you. That's why it sucks. This is good. How many of you know someone who's gay? Okay, that's good. I like hearing that. And how many of you think that being gay and Republican is an oxymoron? Okay, I get that all the time. How many of you are here with the Diversity Center that's on campus? A few of you? Okay, because I know a few were invited in, which is good. Okay. I'm going to answer one question first, and then we're going to open it up. And I have no idea how this dialogue is going to go. I never do when I do these. I've done several of these. But first I'm going to explain why I'm a Republican, because that's the number one question I always get, so let's just get it out of the way. Let's be frank. The Democrats want to pat me on the head and say separate but equal is okay. Now I know a lot of Democrats don't believe that. They believe in full marriage equality, but we've not heard that from this president, nor have we heard it from Harry Reid, nor did we hear it from President Clinton, or from any number of other prominent Democrats that run the party. So I'm not going to get what I want ultimately from them, and I've got a core group of Republicans that just hate me to my face, so I'm not going to get what I want from them either. So I have to look at everything else in my life and decide where do I really fit in the spectrum. When I look at things like taxes, when I look at where I want happening with foreign aid, military policy, if I look at business relationships, how government works at the local, state, and federal level, I found that I was very, very conservative. Unlike our socially left friends who call themselves the religious right, I believe in limited local government. Historically, not always, but historically the Republican Party has been more in line with that type of conservative philosophy than our Democrat friends. Now that's not saying that Democrats are right or wrong, there's just a difference in philosophy. Historically, Democrats have always believed that the government has a place at the table solving society's challenges, which is a great notion, but naturally leads to larger government, and I'm one of those stay the hell out of my life as much as humanly possible kind of guys. So then the secondary question that goes with that is, well, aren't you a libertarian then? Well, no, I'm not a libertarian, because I don't believe in individualism. I've never believed in individualism. In college, we love that. We like to be liberal and individualist at the same time, which makes no sense to me, but that's what we do. But the reality is, every choice we make has an impact on someone else. There is an interconnectivity of life that matters. And so if all we care about is the individual needs, and we ignore the consequences of individual choices, we're likely to make some very significant mistakes that could harm others. And harming others is not something we really want to do. My right to punch you in the face and at your nose. Okay. So I agree with things like seatbelt laws and helmet laws. You know, if I'm married with 3 kids and I go out and get myself killed because I was too stupid to wear a seatbelt because I was a good individual, that directly impacts those lives. Do those people have a say in whether or not I make that choice in my life? And the answer is yes. They're so intertwined with my life that I believe they should have some form of influence or interest in some of the choices that I make. If it's some random guy off the street, I don't really care about that. But there's an interconnectivity there that I care about. So I'm not a libertarian for that reason. I believe the fundamental unit in society is the family. It sounds kind of strange coming from someone who's supposed to be gay and Republican, but family is however you define it. It can be your blood relations, it can be the friends that you have that support you through the worst times when you don't have blood relations nearby, or if those relationships are strained. It can be any number of different bonds that create us, but that family is what matters most. And so we should make laws based upon how we protect that unit. With that, I'm going to go ahead and just open it up for questions. Ask whatever you like, nothing is off the table. We won't talk about graphic sex though, sorry guys. Yes,
I have a question. So you're not libertarian because philosophically you're just not quite compatible with libertarianism, but
Correct.
It seems to me that you want the country to move in the direction of libertarianism, but not to actually obtain libertarianism. So wouldn't you vote for libertarianism anyways?
No. I have voted for a lot of libertarians. I've also voted for Democrats. I've never voted a straight party ticket in my life. Like most of you, at this stage in one's life, I'm still an ideologue. I only want to elect people who agree with me. There are plenty of Republicans who I'd rather see shot. There are also plenty of Democrats I think are crazy. And so I look at an individual and a candidate, where their background's at, and I try to decide for myself whether they're being honest with me. I mean, I am in politics. That means naturally I work with liars, cheats, and thieves. So I had to develop a really good sense for understanding whether or not I was being told the truth and where I sit. I moved here from California to go to college at the University of Utah. I came up here, I remember I went to my very first meeting. Senator Bennett was running for his first term, and I walked into the GOP headquarters in Salt Lake and told them that I was from California, that I was at the University of Utah, that I was conservative, and I'd like to see what I can do to help. And the first person literally told me I was in the wrong place and sent me to the Democrats. Ideology is about making sure that we're protecting oneself, and I like self-interest. So I refuse to vote for someone or work for someone who I know is going to vote contrary to my own life wherever they're at any level of government. If I know they're going to vote for something that's going to harm me, I will support them. So I have my own litmus test, just like everyone has. And of course, my litmus test revolves an awful lot around same-sex issues. Because let's face it, I'm still treated as a second-class citizen in this country in a lot of respects, and I'll be damned if I'm going to my grave that way. Next question? Quiet, yes.
I remember you said that those of us who did not declare ourselves either a Democrat or a Republican, but were very dissatisfied with the political system, that you were part of what's wrong with it.
Correct.
I just like to know, why do you consider the party system so inherent to political process?
Well, the party system works perfectly with the type of government that we have. The government breaks down when people don't participate. So, for example, there will probably be a number of you here who are not registered that lean a little more conservative or a little bit more Democrat, and you're going to say something like, I always have to pick the lesser of two evils and I'm just not really that interested. Well, the reason you're picking the lesser of two evils is because you didn't help put the right candidate on the ballot in the first place. The process works really well with more people in it. So in 2010, for example, we saw on the Republican side of the aisle more than double the number of people attend GOP caucus night than we had seen ever in history. That was a great thing because it meant that the quality of people who were elected as delegates changed. There was not as likely a chance that we were going to elect an extremist from a group of 70 people as opposed to a group of 10 people. How many of you understand how the delegate process works in Utah? Okay, just a few of you. So I'll go ahead and explain it really easy. If you're as confused at the end as you should be, then I'm sure there'll be questions there. In Utah, delegates actually have power. We do this same process everywhere in the country, but only in Utah do delegates actually matter. What happens is we have a night, one night every couple of years that most people ignore. It's March 13th for the Democrats this year and March 15th for the Republicans, where everyone who lives in a little geographic area goes to someone's home or they go to a local school and they nominate people to represent them to their party's convention. Well, those precincts is what that's called, generally have about 1,000 people in them. So you go to this meeting, you talk about a few things, it takes all of an hour. There are so many delegates for both the county and the state that are available in that precinct, and someone runs for a county delegate or someone runs for a state delegate, and they get elected by the people in the room. Well, if I want to be a state delegate, and I go to my caucus, and 10 people show up, and I went there with 4 of my friends, guess who's getting elected? Me. If I go to the same caucus, and 30 people are there, and I only brought 4 of my friends, how likely is it I'm going to be elected? How much more work do I have to do? How many more questions will I have to answer to try and convince the larger group of people that I really do represent what they think, what they want? What happens after we elect those little delegates is we have these funny things called conventions that most people ignore, except for the presidential convention, of course, every 4 years. Everyone knows about that. We watch about 3 minutes of it on the news and then we turn it off and we're done. But what happens at convention is, in Utah, let's say right here, this is House District 2, where Utah State is at right now. Let's say 3 people decide to run for the state legislature from House District 2. In Utah, no more than 2 people can get out of convention. So the delegates who got elected from this area, all the various precincts, they get together, and those 3 people try and convince them that they're the right person for the job. If one person gets 60% of those delegates' votes, they're the automatic nominee for their party, whether it's the Democrat or the Republicans. So they're the ones who go on the ballot. If after 3 ballots, nobody gets more than 60%, the people who are the top 2 vote getters go to a primary. And they have a traditional primary election where everyone in that party votes for who they want to be their nominee on the ballot. So if you think the quality of candidates sucks that you get to choose from in November, it's because we didn't put the right people on the ballot. There are always more than one person running in almost every race, and more of us that participate, that understand who those people are, why they're running, have a better opportunity of electing the person we think is better to our ballot. That's why it's important to participate. Independents, those who are unaffiliated, always have to pick from whatever choices are left from what someone else chose for you. That's why we have the breakdown. The people who show up make the decisions. Currently, on both sides of the aisle, only the extremists show up. So we always end up with extremist candidates. If we want that to change, then we have to participate just once. The challenge is people become more apathetic because, well, the people that have to choose from suck and nothing changes on both sides of the aisle. and there's a downward spiral. Because it doesn't change, people don't want to participate. They don't participate, then we get more extremists. It would only take 1 or 2 elections where enough people in any given area actually showed up and paid attention that we could turn that spiral around and move it back up. I participated, something happened, it wasn't huge, but it made a difference. So I'll try to convince a few other people to participate, and maybe we can turn this whole thing around. That's why that inherently works. Because our system has always been a two-party system, it's always worked a two-party system, and even when we've had a third party that has been successful, it has always supplanted a second party, another party. We started out as the Federalists and Whigs. The Whigs went away for the Federalists and the Republican Democrats. And then when the Democrats and Republicans split and we had 3 parties, the Federalists couldn't adjust appropriately and they went away after a couple of election cycles, and we were left with Republicans and Democrats. The country's right over the last few years to see a potential third party rise again and supplant one of those 2. I don't know if it'll happen or where it will happen. It's possible, but we won't improve the ideology of any party unless we are involved. Which is why I'm involved, despite the fact that I have Republicans who literally hate me to their core, and Democrats who think I'm the craziest loon that's ever walked the face of the planet. I get it all the time, because if I don't try to change the party from the inside out, then I don't have a lot of room to complain. So I'll give you an example of that. 2 weeks ago was the first week of the ledge session for this year. We did something really cool. How many of you guys understand about non-discrimination laws? We passed one here in Logan thanks to many help from people who are in this room and students on campus. We passed non-discrimination that included sexual orientation and gender identity. You guys remember that? Okay. We have tried for 4 years, this was year number 5, to get the state legislature to pay attention to that same law. To say, let's have a uniform law that applies equally across the board to everyone, rather than having 40 different laws throughout the state. The legislature has always ignored it, because there's a supermajority of Republicans, and the bill was always carried by a Democrat. I had the worst first week of my life on Capitol Hill, being taunted and teased and torn to shreds online, on phone calls, emails, the whole 9 yards, because we did something cool. We got a Republican to co-sponsor the bill this year. We had bipartisan support. That poor legislator got beat up like no one's business, but I took even more of that. The consequence of that was that for the first time in the 5 years, the Republican Party was willing to look at it. They're willing to have a dialogue. Even those who disagree know that it's never going to go away, that we better sit together and start having a conversation on whether or not we can actually pass this. It didn't pass this year. It got to committee where it belonged. It didn't pass committee. It got held in committee. But we finally started the dice. Even the most vehement opposition said, James, you're never going to let this go away. And I said, no, it's going to come back every year. It's inevitable. So it's time for you to sit down and start having a conversation about how we're going to make this work. Because it will eventually pass one way or another. I'm not going to let it die. No one else is going to let it die. Equality Utah's not going to let it die. 75% of Utahns agree with passage. Only you people at the legislature are too stupid to recognize this. So we're finally going to have a dialogue after 5 years. My guess is that it'll pass next year, because we finally got enough people involved in the process. Make sense? Other questions? Yes, ma'am.
So how do log cabin Republicans define themselves apart from mainstream Republicans?
We represent the Gay and Lesbian Caucus to the Republican Party. So in Utah, about 1/3 of our membership is actually straight. In fact, one of the things that I encourage groups like this all the time is whether you're Republican, Democrat, unaffiliated, doesn't matter. If you're from Utah, the likelihood is you were raised in a conservative LDS household. It's not a guarantee, but it's pretty likely, which means you have friends and family who are conservatives. On issues like non-discrimination, for example, it's critical that we ask those friends and families to stand up for us. To say, look, let's have this conversation around the dinner table. You know how I got Derek Brown to sponsor a non-discrimination bill? I went to his oldest son and had a conversation and said, your dad doesn't want to talk about this. And he went home and made his dad talk about it over the dinner table. He had a lot more access than I had. And all of a sudden, Derek's like, dude, what the hell are you doing? And I said, well, are you going to talk to me now? It took a lot of hours, invested hours talking to him, but he finally saw it and said, you know, this is the right thing to do. It might cost me my election in the next race, but sponsoring this bill is the right thing to do. And so we did it. Getting our friends and families, whether they're on our side of the political spectrum or not, to pay attention, even if it's just on one issue, makes a world of difference to our own personal lives. So I always encourage that. Yes, sir?
What would it take to pass gay marriage in Utah?
We have to repeal what was Amendment 3 from 2003 or alter it, or the federal government will have to tell us. That's what it would take. Amendment 3 passed in 2003 is the most comprehensive and restrictive bill in the country. Utah currently has the most restrictive rules with regard to same-sex marriage, which is why when you hear people talk the slippery slope argument from some of our friends in my own party, they're up a creek and completely clueless. There's no way we can get anywhere near close to passing anything that has any similarity whatsoever to gay marriage in Utah without it being challenged in the court and losing. So that argument is just stupid, and your friends who use that argument, you should slap them and say, well, read the Constitution and you'll see it's not possible. Which means we should be working on non-discrimination laws, we should be working on visitation hospital rights, we should be working on inheritance rights. There's an inherent this is where the discrimination becomes really apparent. For my Republican friends, why this is such an important thing on our side of the aisle we should pay attention to. My husband and I spent more than $2,500 to get a third of the rights that married couples have. Because I had to hire a number of attorneys, draft a number of documents, and every time we make an adjustment, I have to pay an attorney $250 an hour to look at it. For the same rights that you can go right down to the courthouse and get for $45. Thank you for playing proof positive that I'm not the same. It is not okay. And we have to convince everyone on all sides of the political spectrum that that's the case. The government takes the same money from me that they take from you and from everyone else. I don't care if we talk about how much we like or don't like a subject at the dinner table, at our churches, if we want to talk about it with our friends, I don't care. But don't take it to the place that steals the same money from me as it takes from you. Because I deserve to be treated the same way by the same government. Because I pay for it. Yes?
What are your views on states' rights versus, say, the federal government coming in and support, like, overruling Prop 8 through the Supreme Court?
Well, you know, I'm torn on that. I think gay marriage belongs to the states. I think the concept of marriage belongs to the states. Just as I think abortion belongs to the states. However, unfortunately, too many people don't understand our own Constitution. I actually carry a copy with me everywhere I go. Most everyone refers to the, there's a clause, most people, you guys won't care about this, it's kind of boring, but there's a clause called the Full Faith and Credit Clause of the Constitution in Article 4. Full Faith and Credit Clause says that every state must recognize the rights and privileges of every other state. However, that is subject to congressional oversight. So the federal government decided to pass something called the Defense of Marriage Act, which said if you got married in state A, state B could say, I don't want to recognize it. If they chose to do so, they were able to do so, and it wasn't a violation of the Constitution, and they were exercising their 10th Amendment right for states' rights. The problem with that is the very next line talks about immunity and prosecution of criminal acts. And it says that every citizen, no matter what, is entitled to the exact same immunities across the board that the several states enact, which means they can't pass gun laws. That's a conflict. If I get married in state A and I come to state B, just like I have a driver's license or a concealed carry permit, or I've got health insurance or car insurance, the state has to recognize that. Because, for example, even though it was overturned by the Supreme Court years ago, Utah still has anti-sodomy laws on the books. I can't be prosecuted for sodomy in the state of Utah because of the Supreme Court decision. That has nothing to do with the fact that if the state I got married in said it was fine, Utah would be unjustly charging me with a criminal act if it tried to enforce that law, because I'm entitled to the same criminal immunities as everyone else, according to the U.S. Constitution, no matter what the state constitution says. So states' rights are important to me. I think the state should handle these issues on their own. But I also think that a state like Utah should be forced to recognize the marriages performed out of state for someone who moves in state. They may not have to perform the divorce, but they should be required to recognize the marriage. They don't have to perform the marriage themselves, but if I got rights and privileges in state A, they should be required in state B, because I have freedom of association and freedom of movement. I don't have to provide papers to go from state A to state B. It's not such sovereign jurisdiction that I need a passport or that I have to apply for citizenship, because those issues are handled by the federal government, specifically by Article 1, Section 8 of the U.S. Constitution. So there's a balancing act to be made. Does that help?
It does.
Yes, sir.
I think one of the biggest arguments, especially with social conservatives or whatever you call them, is the definition. You know,
Definition of marriage.
Yeah, I don't think anyone, at least for me, most people that are on the extremes, you know, they can see that people should be able to, you know, if their sexual lives should be able to.
You're right.
However, the definition of marriage is what's concerning to me, because I think it's important that.
So let's talk about that. Salt Lake is the best example of why the definition of marriage is irrelevant to the government, and why the government shouldn't be involved in the marriage business in the first place. That's the argument that I take. If the government is going to be involved in marriage, they have to give it to me, because they can treat me the same as everyone else because they take my money. However, the great argument, marriage has been around for thousands of years, and it's always been between one man and one woman, which is all lies. That's not true. Marriage has been around for thousands of years. It has historically been primarily between men and women. It could be one man and multiple women. It could be one woman and multiple men. Some homosexual relationships were common in places like Greece and in ancient Rome. However, property rights in that were handled through dowries and marriages to women. The concept of marriage for love didn't evolve until 700 or 800 years ago. And the concept of the government being involved in marriage also didn't evolve until about 500 years ago. No government gave benefits from the state for being married until very, very recently in marriage. Marriage has always been in the purview of faith. So if you go to Salt Lake, up by the University of Utah, at least it's red. I could be talking about BYU, that'd be worse, I know. But there's a Unitarian Universalist church on 100 South. They will perform a same-sex marriage between a man and a man, or a woman and a woman, or one man and one woman. That is their faith tradition. If I head a few blocks west, the First Baptist Church on about 5th East and South Temple, or 100 South, South Temple, right in that range, will recognize the Unitarian's marriage that is heterosexual, but will not recognize the same-sex marriage in either case. If you head a few blocks farther west, you end up at the Joseph Smith Memorial Building, where, like the First Baptist Church, they will recognize the heterosexual marriage, but they will not recognize the same-sex marriage. But if you don't get the temple marriage upgrade, it's just not worth as much. That's the reality. So even in Salt Lake, on the same street, among the same religion, Christianity, there's not uniform application of the concept of marriage. It's a violation of the Unitarians' freedom of religion to say that the government will only sanction this belief system and not this belief system. So I argue, personally, that if the government wants to issue certificates of rutabaga or call everything a civil union, I'm good with that. Because marriage belongs to the purview of religion. The temple sealer here in Logan at the Logan Temple does not derive his power from the county clerk. Based on LDS tradition, he derives his power directly from God through a prophet. And what he does is bound in a very sacred, very permanent way that is held very carefully to the hearts of those who participate in those ceremonies. The state has no business saying whether or not that is valid or invalid. They should be able to perform that rite and service for their community based on their own traditions. and we should respect the traditions and faiths that others have with the same thing. If we want to talk about the sanctity of marriage, we have to get marriage out of the purview of government. There shouldn't be tax benefits for being married, just like there shouldn't be tax hits for being single. Those kinds of things don't exist. That's one of the reasons that's a little bit of a libertarian bent. Okay? I don't believe in taxes. I don't believe in tax credits for anything. We all have to support the government, but the government can do a lot less. Does that help a little bit?
Well, no, because my question was do you find it offensive to be called a civil union? Because what I do is
well, separate but equal is not equal. We decided that 4 years ago. So I'm not going to have a civil union. My husband and I are married legally in a state where marriage was legal. I have a license. If Utah chooses to discriminate against me, they're welcome to do so, but I will call it what it is, discrimination.
Right. Well, see, my definition of marriage is, can you have kids? Because in order to be called a marriage, can you have a family? And I just.
But that's offensive to thousands of heterosexuals.
What?
My wife and I were married for 6 years, and we couldn't have children. So my marriage is invalid because I couldn't have children in a heterosexual relationship?
Well, 90% of the time you can.
You're right, but the government isn't trying to protect the rights of only 90% of the population. The government's job is to protect the rights of 100% of the population, which is why those discussions belong, again, around our kitchen tables, in our churches, in our families and friends, where we want to, what values we want to pass on to our children is very important to us as individuals. We have the right to pass those on in whatever manner we see fit. What I don't want is the government picking winners and losers when my definition and your definition may be different. They don't get the right to choose who's right and who's wrong. We both get to be right in that situation. Our faith may choose who's right and wrong. Our clergy, our family may choose who's right and wrong. They get to make those value judgments. The government shouldn't make those value judgments, in my opinion.
So it's all secular.
The government is secular. Now, do we have religious principles that have to be applied? Sure. But, for example, I'll use the Sharia law example. Okay? Everyone is terrified of Sharia law in a large group on the Republican side of the aisle that the Islamic faith is going to impose Sharia law and everyone's going to get killed. The Sharia law is basically the Ten Commandments. It also has some extra things that people twist that are extreme, like I have the right to kill my daughter if she goes out and has premarital sex. Well, the whole bundle of that is considered Sharia law by various Islamic traditions, and there are about 20 different Islamic traditions as there are hundreds of Christian traditions. However, in this country, to say thou shalt not steal is not a Christian-only principle. It is also an Islamic principle. It's also a Jewish principle. However, if I want to kill my daughter because she had premarital sex, that's murder, and in the tradition of this country, your rights end where another person's rights begin. So clearly you did harm and you should be punished. That's not a violation of Sharia law or Christian law or Jewish law. That's a violation of law, of the rights that exist. We have a lot of inherent values, but those values, while they came from a Christian tradition, are not only reflective of a Christian tradition. And to say that only the Christian tradition is what should be valued, as many people do in our country, violates the rights of everyone else of a non-Christian faith, including our Jewish brothers and sisters who we like to hold arms and hands with. So instead of saying it's only Christian tradition, now we say it's a Judeo-Christian tradition. But the Buddhists don't believe in killing and stealing. Most Muslims don't believe in killing and stealing. Most Hindus don't believe in killing and stealing. It's not unique among one faith, the traditional common tenets that exist. So we need to be careful as a government, not saying it's secular only, but as a secularized government trying to honor the faith traditions of our entire population, we have to be very careful that we are not deliberately stepping on the rights and privileges of others in order to assert our dominance. I have the same right to the public square as anyone else does. I have the same right to petition the government as anyone else does. And if someone disagrees with me, it is inherently incumbent upon me to defend their right to disagree with me. Because if I don't do that, then someday someone will not defend my right, and I will lose that. That's the beginning of tyranny, without doubt. Yes, sir?
Do you feel that those interested in advocating for gay rights would be able to have see more progress when working through an organization like the Log Cabin Republicans or working through the Libertarian Party?
In this case, definitely the Log Cabin Republicans. Not to be harsh to the Libertarian Party, but they're never going to elect anybody in Utah that make up like 1% of the population. They have no voice. Libertarians who want to get elected run as Republicans, just like Dr. Paul is running as a Republican, despite the fact we all know he's a libertarian at heart. His only chance of having his message heard on a large audience is getting it out to the largest number of people. In this case, the Log Cabin Republicans have access to a larger group of people on that conservative side of the aisle, so that bent helps tremendously. The majority of legislators, sadly, especially from rural Utah, including legislators right here in Cache County, their only experience with someone who's gay is with me. I hope they have a positive experience. But until everyone sees individuals as individuals, and we start looking at the similarities and not the differences, what brings us together rather than takes us apart, it's hard to have common dialogue even when we will agree to disagree, as happens often. Advocacy work for same-sex issues will only happen when the people who are making the decisions know and understand that what they do impacts the lives of others. Governor Herbert is a really good friend of mine. He was here last month talking with a number of people. He thinks twice about some legislation because he knows that it will affect me personally, and he cares about me as an individual. Now, he may choose to sign that legislation, he may choose to not sign it or veto it, but he gives more careful consideration because of that relationship. The more of us that are involved in the process means all of us will think more deliberately about all critical issues, not gay issues. The other thing that's important with regard to advocacy, what makes a difference for me to be successful, is that I don't just talk about gay issues. I talk about taxes and Utah lands and natural resources and the environment and transportation issues, because being gay is one small part of who I am. It does not define my character. And the more people see that and understand that, the better we are in having dialogue about that. I work on a broad range of issues, so legislators respect me because they know that I'm not a one-trick pony. And no one in this room is a one-trick pony. Everyone has a variety of things that matter to them. If you're going to be involved all the way, because you will have far more credibility. Does that help?
So just kind of going back to what we were
Yes.
talking about earlier, the idea that
I'm gonna grab water while I do that.
yeah, go for it. The idea that because you're doing something and you're not harming me makes it okay. I find that hard to believe that cultural values don't play a huge part in it. For instance, in Utah, and this is an accepted fact, most people are LDS, and most people view marriage between a man and a woman.
Agreed.
So it's going to be very tough for someone who's outside of the culture or who has a different belief about marriage to impose that on the masses. And I think really that's
I'm not imposing on the masses.
That's
I'm
not,
having your view imposed upon me because you're the majority. Thomas Jefferson said the definition democracy is nothing more than mob rule, where 51% of the population can take away the rights of the other 49. Now, Sam Adams was a huge theologian. His father was a Unitarian and a deist, like Ben Franklin. Sam Adams was a Puritan through and through. Thomas Jefferson thought that democracy was the bane of existence. He wanted a pure republic. The differences of opinion among the founders was great. Cultural norms make sense. Protecting rights and protecting cultural norms do not have to be mutually exclusive. However, our Constitution, the state Constitution as well as the federal Constitution, say that when the two clash, rights matter more. They always have. What we want to avoid, going back to what you said earlier, is where do we have those discussions? Do those discussions belong in Washington, D.C.? Or should we be having those discussions in our states? Should we be having them in our local communities? Non-discrimination ordinances is a really good example. Utahns do not discriminate. It's a violation of our values to discriminate. Utah law says if you violate that value in these ways, there's a consequence. If, however, you choose to violate those values in this way, we will ignore it. Utahns, as an overriding rule, don't want to discriminate. They don't agree with gay marriage. The statistics are very specific in all the polling data that's been done, that that's the situation. They don't want to support gay marriage, but they don't want to have discrimination. The governor said to me 2 years ago, if you want to see non-discrimination passed at the state level, we need to see a groundswell of support from local communities who've had this discussion among themselves to see if that's a common value. Just as we had with the marriage debate in 2003 on Amendment 3. I came out on the losing side of that argument. I was married at the time to my wife, but on the non-discrimination side, we're making a difference. Cities are having those discussions. Counties are having those discussions. At some point in time, there's going to be so many different varieties of that type of law that it will only make sense for the state at that point to say we need some uniformity. Businesses are already asking for that uniformity because they don't want to have to try and figure out what laws in various jurisdictions are okay for them to do. And so there's an economic side to that issue as well that affects the culture. And so where I go with that is I'm not saying that marriage is perfect or not perfect. What I'm saying is that it needs to be handled in the right way with the right people. It's a discussion we should be having right here, as opposed to asking Washington to settle. Do I agree with the Supreme Court's Prop 8 decision, the Federal Court of Appeals Prop 8 decision that came out day before yesterday? The answer is yes, I do. I agree with it only because it did something unique. It had a very narrow, specific ruling that said what you did was to change the Constitution to violate California's Constitution because they already had an option available. If the Supreme Court were to uphold that decision, it would only affect the state of California. It would not affect same-sex marriage throughout the country. Because what the court said was, you asked the majority to violate the rights of the minority on a right that already existed, that was already being performed in the state of California. Utah chose to enact a law before those rights existed in the state of Utah. So that court decision would have no bearing on Utah's Amendment 3. But it would have bearing in California, where they were performing same-sex marriage first. That's an appropriate review as opposed to a one-size-fits-all philosophy, which is what everyone on both sides is trying to get.
Well, but I think that's beneficial. I really do. There's some things that really need to be streamlined. For instance, if I go to Mexico and say everyone needs to speak English, you need to understand what I'm saying. Where's the moderator? That's what we have as a cultural thing. They speak Spanish here, just like they come here. They can expect Spanish to work. They can't. It's the same. I think it's the same thing in the United States. There are some things that need to be streamlined, and I think marriage. Next question.
And
but, I am a traditional conservative.
That's fine. And you and I will agree to disagree. Yeah. Okay. Sir, behind you had a question as well, or a comment. Yes.
With all that being said, whatever your personal views aside, and just in general, how can this United States constitutionally ban gay marriage? I guess, and part of me believes my religious beliefs, I understand, but from a legal point of view aspect, how can they say just because you?
Well, that's the problem with inequality. Let's talk about DOMA for a second. Does everyone know what DOMA is? The Defense of Marriage Act. It was passed in '93 with Bill Clinton. Advocacy from a lot of people. Here's one of the challenges with DOMA. DOMA says the federal government will only recognize marriage between a man and a woman, and that the states may choose to do what they want to do with regard to marriage licensing. Here's the number one problem with that. If I live in Massachusetts and I file a joint tax return in Massachusetts, I can't file a joint tax return with the federal government. But if I live in Utah and I file a joint tax return because I'm a heterosexual couple only, I can still file a joint tax return with the federal government. There is, by all intents and purposes, for most states, between a $6,000 and $10,000 benefit to being married filing jointly to the federal government. Now, naturally, I don't believe that that should exist in the first place, but it does exist right now. So the federal government is choosing to deliberately discriminate against some of the citizens of the several states, which is a violation of the contract between the federal government through the U.S. Constitution and those states, because they're deliberately treating some of their citizens differently. If, like I said, the states should be having this discussion, but if the states are going to have this discussion and this belongs to the states, then the federal government must treat everyone in each state the same way the state treats each state. Just as we have to do when we're dealing with international treaties with regard to monetary issues or dealing with weapons issues or nuclear waste or that kind of material. So there's some challenges there that exist that could be fixed while we have this national debate that is going to take a while, but that would give us some breathing room to have that in a fair and just way.
So does it just kind of come down to like how certain judges interpret the law?
It does and it doesn't, and that's one of the challenges, is that how the branches of government work. A lot of power has been ceded to the courts. One of the things I'd like to dispel for my Republican friends is the notion of activist judges. Judges cannot be activists. There's a checks and balance system within the judicial system that is far, far more complex than the checks and balances at the federal government or the state government level. There are dozens of different types of appeals. There are dozens of different courts to appeal to until you eventually get to the Supreme Court. So one judge who consistently is overturned isn't really doing a whole lot despite whatever activism they'd like to have on whatever issues that they would like to have. The judge's job is to interpret whether or not the law is being applied in a way that has constitutional merit, whether it's a state constitution or a federal constitution. And so it's hard for a judge to be activist in that regard. However, judges are constantly overturned. They have personal bias. That's why those checks and balances must exist. We must be careful not to tinker with that. One of the things that we do in Utah, which I personally think is a problem, is we vote on whether to retain judges. That actually politicizes the work that they do, rather than trying to keep them apolitical. That makes the problem worse, not better. But we like the term because it's a good sound bite. We like the term because it looks good on the news, because we can sell it in a 7-second advertisement in politics, because we all know that it takes about 7 seconds to get from the door to the trash can for most mail or literature. So we have to be a lot more informed as a populace. We can't make decisions based on the headline in a newspaper or the nightly news 2-second reel of what was done here or there. Being involved in a voting republic or democracy, however you want to look at it, requires some work. Those who do the work show up, and those who show up make the decisions for the rest of us. Sir?
You hear a lot about money in politics, and I would
Yeah.
go so far as to suggest that the LDS Church has its hands in Utah politics, but where does the Utah Republican Party and you know, theocracy begin? Because you really
Well,
do
that
see-
is a hard question to ask. It depends on the issue. The
Yeah.
church does a phenomenal job, in my opinion, of staying out of most issues. They have specific reasons for doing that, which is good, unless they see something as being a moral issue. The marriage issue is one of those that we discuss. But at the same time, the legislature is overwhelmingly LDS, and they're sometimes chickens. I actually had a state senator say to me last week, if the home teachers come and tell me to vote for this bill, I'll vote for it. Well, the home teachers aren't coming up from Temple Square to tell him to vote on that bill, because that's not what they do most of the time. However, if the church decides to come out on a position, that decision is pretty much final. We have to be careful of that. Remember, and this is going to offend my LDS friends, I grew up LDS, I understand the philosophy. I tell people who ask about religion that I'm paralleling the iron rod. I still see it, I'm just not on an intercept course at the moment. I value the heritage that I have. I value the goals and the work ethic and the history and all the values that came with that in my own heritage. I value all of that. The church and I disagree on a couple of issues, and the LDS church is an all or nothing proposition. However, the LDS church's end goal is a theocracy with a perfect person running the world. So it's kind of ironic for me to listen to, especially libertarian LDS members, who want to protect liberty and individualism when the goal of the faith is not to protect individuality and libertarianism. It's to have all of us be the same in a world that's protected with the same values run by a perfect being. Until such time, we have an imperfect world with imperfect beings running the world. And from my point of view, the best thing that we can do as a party, as a nation, as individuals, is to make sure that we protect the rights of people who disagree with us, so that we don't end up with a tyrannical situation, so that we don't end up with the freedom of all being gradually taken away because we were unwilling to stand up for everyone. I can take one more question, I'll take it in the back here, and then I have got to stop. I could go on for hours, and so you guys probably could too, but I think they want us to get out of here.
Yeah, if this question's too personal, let me know, but I was wondering if you have children from your previous marriage.
I do not, because we could not have children.
Oh,
So
that's
that
right.
marriage was invalid and irrelevant by a large number of people. The purpose of marriage is not procreation. Family is procreation to some degree, but we could not have children. And Utah's kind of weird when it comes to the whole children thing. You can adopt children if you're married, and you can adopt children if you're single. But if you're cohabitating, whether you're in a heterosexual or same-sex situation, you cannot adopt children. Because, as I was told, that would be an imitation of a family and not a real family. I actually had a Republican tell me, a friend of mine, a few weeks ago, that my family was fraudulent, that I had a fraudulent life, and that I had an imitation family and not a real family, because I did not understand or subscribe to their specific tenet on how life should be. It's kind of hard to deal with that, but you deal with that on all sides of the aisle. I mean, I have gay friends who say that I'm crazy and up in the night too, and that I obviously am a self-loathing gay that has no self-esteem and doesn't care about anything because I'm not doing what I can to fix to help the cause. The reality is I'm doing more for the cause by being a Republican than I ever would be as a Democrat. No social justice, and I'm going to use that term even though Republicans don't like it. Society changes and evolves on a regular basis. 40 years ago, it was unthinkable to marry a black person. Interracial marriage was terrible. 100 years ago, we had slavery. We had preachers preaching that it was okay to own people using the same scriptures that they now say it's not okay to own people with. Society evolves and changes, but no evolution, whether it's the women's right to vote or civil rights for minorities like African Americans and Native Americans, etc. None of that ever happened without somebody from all sides of the political spectrum being at the table. No one party can do this. Having a discussion with yourself and moving from chair to chair is irrelevant. You have to put all the stakeholders at the table. There's a difference between finding common ground and compromising one's principles. And we must find common ground to keep our country where it belongs. If you have other questions, I'll talk to anyone individually, but I do appreciate your time. And I hope that you'll be a little bit more encouraged to be involved. Being involved makes all the difference in the world. I know because I'm living proof of it.
I'd like to thank James for coming, and actually as a token of our appreciation, we actually got him a couple things. One of these things we've actually got to actually hang in his office to let his friends on Capitol Hill know who he roots for.
That's awesome. My husband went to BYU and I went to the U, so.
Compromise on Utah State.
And we also have a coupon for some free Aggie ice cream.
Aggie ice cream is the best in the state. Y'all know.
So we can give him one more round.